Good afternoon, and welcome to today's presentation on the FDA's July peptide review and what the PCAC committee means for peptide compounding. Couldn't be a better topic for the latest developments that are happening, and so I'm excited to get into some of the unique things that are going to happen over the next couple days. I'm joined by my colleague Edgar Asebey. My name is Jesse Dresser. I'm a partner with the law firm Frier Levitt. We are a boutique healthcare life science law firm located in Pine Brook, New Jersey and New York City. We have a robust team of healthcare and life science attorneys and handle a variety of life science issues on behalf of compounding pharmacies, 503B outsourcing facilities, API manufacturers, repackagers, wholesale distributors, and other healthcare providers. Please note that everything in this presentation is for educational purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice. Any references to trademark names is purely for educational purposes only and shouldn't be construed as an endorsement or statement on any of them. As I mentioned, my name is Jesse Dresser. I am a partner with the firm. I head up the firm's pharmacy practice group. My clients are generally within that drug supply channel, include compounding pharmacies, 503B outsourcing facilities, API manufacturers, repackagers, and others in the pharmacy supply channel. I'm joined by my colleague Edgar Asebey. Edgar has over 25 years in food and drug law regulation and experience and litigation and regulation. He has represented a number of different stakeholders in this space, including drug suppliers, compounding pharmacies, outsourcing facilities, and more. And so today we're going to be talking about peptides and the upcoming Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee meeting and what that means for compounding pharmacies, patient access, and more. So throughout today's presentation, we'll talk through a number of things, including how peptides are regulated and what they are, why peptides have exploded in popularity over the past several months and years, some of the recent attention that has been placed on them by HHS Secretary RFK Jr., and the renewed federal attention that has come as a result of that. We'll also talk about the flip-flopping posture that the FDA has taken, both kind of for peptides, against peptides, back to somewhere in the middle at this point. And then we'll talk about what is actually going to happen over the next 2 days. What is the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee actually going to be doing, and what will happen as a result of this 2-day meeting? And then finally, we'll talk about why 503A pharmacies should care about this upcoming meeting, as well as why other stakeholders like 503B outsourcing facilities, API manufacturers, repackagers, med spas, wellness and longevity clinics, telehealth companies, physicians, nurse practitioners should care as well, because if this committee creates a pathway for a lawful ability to compound these peptide products, it will have massive implications beyond just compounding pharmacies. And then finally, we'll also talk about research use only or RUO suppliers and how they stand to be impacted by the current regulation, as well as what could happen as a result of these 2-day meetings. So with that, let's start with what a peptide is. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Edgar, who has a clinical background, to be able to give us a little bit more scientific explanation.
Thank you, Jesse. So Jesse sort of created the landscape as to where this PCAC meeting sits in the context of the peptide sector as it stands today. So let's start in the more basic part. We won't get very much into the chemistry, but it's important to know a couple of distinctions. So a peptide is merely a short chain of amino acids that are linked together by peptide bonds, thus the name. Essentially a small protein-like molecule that can hit receptors and cause certain metabolic changes. That's what the different peptides do. Their tertiary structure allows them to bind to different receptors, and therefore when you put them in your bloodstream, they have certain metabolic effects, some of which are desirable. But FDA has defined peptides as an amino acid polymer that has 40 or fewer amino acids. And this is important because by regulatory definition, FDA considers those drugs. And you'll see a little later why that's important. So 40 amino acids or fewer that's a drug for FDA. Amino acid polymers, meaning these peptide bonded chains of amino acids that have more than 40 amino acids, that's considered a protein. And we've all heard of proteins. We're very familiar with proteins. But importantly, if it has 40 amino acids or more, it is considered a biologic by FDA. Why is this distinction important? It's important because compounding pharmacies and outsourcing facilities, 503As and 503Bs, are prohibited from compounding and using products that are considered to be biologics. So if a peptide is 41 amino acids long, you would not be able to, it would be unlawful to attempt to compound that drug or that biologic in FDA's terms. The regulatory framework is split into three. The approved peptides, there are certain peptides that have been either approved as drugs, including some of which you've heard of, semaglutide, tirzepatide, liraglutide, dulaglutide, exenatide, and tesamorelin. Tesamorelin, semaglutide, and tirzepatide are the ones that you've probably heard of. Those are the first two are Ozempic and Wegovy, and Lilly's and Novo Nordisk's GLP-1s. So here's the first approach where we see that GLP-1s are also peptides. They're just very long peptides. Then all the other peptides, other than these that are named here under this first bullet, everything else is an unapproved peptide, meaning it has not gone through the FDA process of clinical trials, phase 1, 2, and 3, and then an approved NDA. But they're considered experimental chemicals or peptides or drugs. Another word for the research use only peptides, I always remind people, is not for human use, right? So many of the peptides that we're talking about right now have never been approved, and that's why they are the subject matter of the PCAC's process that we're going through in the next couple of days. So many of the well-known peptides are not components of FDA drugs, but some of them still have a lawful pathway for use in compounding pharmacies. And we'll get into that a little more later, but certain peptides have never gone through the FDA process, but through alternative processes, FDA considers them sufficiently safe and effective to be included in compounded medicines. And then there's the RUO peptides, which frankly is the biggest source of peptides for people that are using peptides right now. It is, and I'll get into the history of how this evolved a little bit later, but research use only peptides, when you hear that word, you should also immediately hear not for human use, right? These are for research use, not for human use. And, oftentimes many of our clients come to us and ask us about this gray area. As an FDA regulatory attorney, I can tell you it's not great. It's an unapproved drug. It's outside of the of what the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act permits. It's just that there hasn't been enough enforcement to demonstrate to everyone that this is an unapproved drug and you shouldn't be selling it.
So with that, talk a little bit about the landscape that we're coming up at. So we have this upcoming PCAC meeting that's going to look at potentially including certain products on some interim lists. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about what types of products a compounding pharmacy can make a compound out of. So compounding pharmacies are able to make products that contain FDA-approved drugs. So for example, if you have, let's say, a pill that you have to turn into a solution for, say, a child to take, or for someone that has difficulty swallowing, you can use literally the FDA-approved commercially available product and convert it into a compound. But you can also use what are known as bulk drug substances or bulk APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients. This is like the pure micronized powder version of the active ingredients. And essentially, you're allowed to use those bulk drug substances, provided, like I said, they are accompanied by a certificate of analysis. They are manufactured in an FDA-approved facility. But in addition to that, the specific types of bulk drug substances that can be used, the specific ingredients, depend on the regulatory status of those particular ingredients. So for a 503A compounding pharmacy, they can use a bulk drug substance provided it is either a component of an FDA-approved drug, or it has a valid United States Pharmacopoeia or National Formulary monograph, or if it's not a component of an FDA-approved drug and it doesn't have a monograph, it then appears on the FDA bulk drug substances used in compounding list, commonly referred to as the 503A bulks list. So this is a list created by the FDA that says, okay, these are products that don't have a monograph, they aren't a component of an FDA-approved drug, but we're going to take the position that there is a basis for them to be used in pharmacy compounding. Compare that with the 503B outsourcing facilities. So a 503B outsourcing facility can only use a bulk drug substance provided it affirmatively appears on a list maintained by the FDA where there is a clinical need. This is the 503A bulks list, or the drug product appears on the FDA's drug shortage list at the time of compounding, distribution, and dispensing. So the key distinction here is it's an open permissibility to compound anything that has a monograph, is a component of an FDA-approved drug, or appears on a list if you're a 503A. But for a 503B, you can't compound anything unless the FDA says you can compound it. And even though the law that created these lists is now 13 years old, these lists are still in development. It's still moving at a snail's pace as to how these lists are being created. And so there are a lot of products that theoretically could have otherwise gotten onto these lists or been finalized, but just hasn't gotten around to doing it. Now, if we look at the GLP-1 space, we saw the 503Bs really get into that, mainly because there was a shortage. And so that's where we saw the 503B outsourcing facilities enter that space. Now that the shortage is over, they're kind of locked out. And so when we talk about this upcoming meeting, we're really focused on the 503A bulks list, because that's going to be these products that don't have a monograph, aren't components of an FDA-approved drug, but perhaps there's a basis that the FDA decides to allow these to be included. So right now, because I mentioned these lists are not finalized, there is what's called the interim bulks list. This is a list of drugs that the FDA hasn't made the final decision on, but they've essentially created different gradations of products that they think they're ultimately going to rule on. They think they're ultimately going to finalize, that there's been enough data supplied to help make a decision, and they're kind of crafting in a interim workaround, an interim lifeline to basically be able to potentially compound certain products. And so they've created this bulk list, and they've created 3 categories of products that could be on this list. Category 1 includes substances that may be eligible for inclusion on the 503A bulks list in the future. They were nominated with sufficient supporting information for the FDA to evaluate them, and they don't appear on any other list. These are products that essentially the FDA is saying, okay, we have enough data. We think that there's a strong possibility that they will ultimately make it on the list. We don't see significant safety considerations, so we're putting them on category 1. If they are on category 1, that means while they're on category 1, even though they aren't on the formal finalized FDA bulks list, they could still be, there's essentially enforcement discretion. They can be compounded by compounding pharmacies, and the FDA is going to give them a free pass. Then there's category 2 products. These are substances that were nominated with sufficient support and supporting information to permit the FDA to evaluate them, and may ultimately be included for inclusion on the 503A bulks list. But the FDA has identified significant safety risks related to the use of these substances in compounding pending further evaluation. So again, these are products that the FDA has enough data on that could create a need for them to eventually be included on the bulks list. But the FDA has significant safety concerns that haven't been mitigated based on the information that's available to them. And so what that means is, in the meantime, products that are on category 2 cannot be lawfully compounded. And then you have products in category 3. These are products, again, substances that may ultimately be included for eligible for inclusion on the bulks list, but didn't have sufficient information when they were nominated for the FDA to evaluate them. They can be renominated in the future with additional supporting information. But right now, the FDA has already kind of passed on them. They've already said, listen, you had your shot at the interim list. We didn't get enough information. even if it comes again, we're probably not going to prioritize it, but we're not ruling it out forever. So what does this mean? It means that category 1 products, if a product is on category 1, it may be compounded even though it's not on the finalized list, even if that drug doesn't have a monograph or is the component of an FDA-approved drug. If the product is on category 2 or category 3, it cannot be compounded. There's oftentimes this question of, well, what happens if a product is on none of them? Right? What happens if a product is not on category 1, category 2, or category 3? What happens there? And we'll talk about some of those specifics, in the context of some specific products in a minute. But ultimately, from a technical perspective, if a bulk drug substance is going to be used by a compounding pharmacy, it either needs to be a component of an FDA-approved drug, it needs to have a USP or NF monograph, or it needs to be on the bulks list. And if it's not any one of those 3, from a technical perspective, it cannot be used in pharmacy compounding. So let's talk about some of the specific peptides, and in particular, the most popular ones that we get asked about over and over and over and over again. So we've gone through and listed out some of the more popular ones that we have seen pharmacies ask us about, that we have seen has come up from time to time. And we've tried to create a little bit of a cheat sheet that indicates kind of where they sit and what the regulatory status is and whether they are up for inclusion. So if we look at these products, none of these common ones, BPC-157, TB-500, Impamorelin, AOD 9604, Sermorelin, none of these are FDA-approved products. There are a couple like Sermorelin and Cemex that have kind of unique backgrounds. For example, Sermorelin is not currently an FDA-approved product. It was formerly a formally approved product, but it was removed from the market and removed from approval for business reasons, not for safety and efficacy. So it had technically been formally approved, even though it's technically been removed from approval at this point. And then also Cemex is a product that's not approved here, although it is approved in some other countries like Russia. So off the bat, these are all products that don't have FDA approval, so that we can't rely on that for pharmacy compounding. Of these products, there are several that are included for consideration by the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee. These include BPC-157, TB-500, KPV, Cemex, and MOTSC. These are ones, and there's a few other products as well, but these are among the more popular peptides that are up for potential inclusion on category 1 list. And so with respect to these products, like I said, none of them have been approved as a drug. BPC-157, we've, in addition to interest in wanting to provide it as a product in a compounded drug, we've also seen interest in potentially wanting to sell it as a dietary supplement. It doesn't currently have lawful status as a dietary supplement. And in fact, the FDA has issued warning letters around this particular product, depending on how it's sold. Other products that are worth noting here, like CJC 1295, Impamorelin, and AOD 9604, these are products that had been previously reviewed by the FDA and actually rejected. They'd been submitted for potential inclusion on these interim bulks lists and had been rejected at the time. So it's interesting to note kind of what's happened there, what kind of the background is there, and maybe try to think about what will happen differently at this point. With respect to NAD+, this one has somewhat complex regulatory status. There has been warnings and bulletins put out by the FDA related to certain uses of this product and certain sourcing of it. However, there may be compliant pathways to be able to use this in pharmacy compounding. With respect to Sermorelin, this is another one where, like I said, because it had been previously approved, there could arguably be a basis to compound it because of that prior approval, even though it's no longer on the market. But like I said, the rest of the products haven't been approved as a drug, but there may be some opportunity to rely on the glutathione as a dietary supplement. So that's the current regulatory status for a lot of these popular peptides. And it will remain to be seen kind of what happens in the next week or so with the ones that are currently subject for review by the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee. So with that, I'm going to kick it. I'm going to want to talk through what this PCAC committee is, what its powers are, and who's currently serving on it. So the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee is an independent FDA advisory committee. It's established under the Drug Quality and Security Act of 2013, and the goal is to provide scientific, technical, and medical advice on issues related to pharmacy compounding under both Sections 503A and Sections 503B of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So this is essentially an advisory board. It's designed to get key people involved, technical experts, and have them look at key clinical information and scientific data and render a opinion that the FDA can or cannot rely upon in making their decisions. So in terms of its powers, the PCAC doesn't have the ability to make law. They don't have the ability to bind the FDA in any way, shape, or form. It's purely an advisory role. They can review the evidence and provide non-binding recommendations to the FDA, including whether nominated bulk drug substances should be eligible for compounding under Section 503A. But the FDA retains final decision-making authority and can accept, modify, or outright reject the committee's recommendations. So in terms of the people that are serving on the July 2026 meetings right now, there are a number of physicians, both medical doctors and doctors of osteopathy serving. There's a NABP representative, and there are other pharmacists serving as well. There are other appointed members, including additional FDA officials, industry representatives, and temporary voting members. We've been tracking some of the nominations for inclusion on this committee, and some of the folks that have been included. We know that there has been a little bit of an informal push to include more peptide-friendly people on this committee, more of a push to get folks that have previously come out and spoken out in favor or have a viewpoint that is pro-peptide. I think that's the goal of the administration, in particular RFK, is to try to get as many people on the committee as possible that will help kind of advance that overall agenda of trying to get peptides recommended and approved. So it'll remain to be seen kind of how the committee ultimately shakes out in terms of its back and forth, in terms of its biases, in terms of its overall interests and viewpoints. So with that, I'll kick it over to Edgar to talk specifically about this meeting and what the process is going to look like.
Thank you, Jesse. So, as Jesse mentioned, this is an advisory committee, and with regard to these, the current set of peptides, a little later I'll show the history, the chronology of how we got here. But right now, I want to inform you that the meeting was announced by FDA in the Federal Register, as is required, inviting the public to submit written comments and allow interested parties to request time to speak before the committee. And the committee is being asked to review the available scientific and medical evidence for each one of these 7 peptides and recommend whether it should be eligible for compounding under Section 503A. Again, emphasizing that FDA is not required to follow the committee's recommendations. And tomorrow and Friday, what will happen at these 2 meetings? FDA will present its analysis. And again, I'll go into that in a later slide. Stakeholders will have the opportunity to speak. The committee members will discuss each peptide and then vote on a recommendation for FDA to consider on that day. So the peptides that are being discussed tomorrow, at the end of the meeting, the committee will have a vote, basically, place on, permit the compounding of those peptides or not. Those are the that's the ultimate question that the committee is asking and being asked to answer. I think it's important to look at the actual therapeutic claims that are being made for these compounds by their sponsors, and also the FDA scientific assessment. And let me put that in context. FDA, CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the division that deals with drugs at FDA, has scientists. They do research and regulate what drugs can be placed into the marketplace and not. And the scientific section of CDER has already evaluated each one of these 7 peptides. And for all 7 consistently, they have proposed that they not be added to the 503A bulk list, meaning they not be allowed to be compounded. And it's important to see what their rationale is. Remember, these are scientists. These are not members of the community or interested members in the sector. This is strictly the scientific side. And so reasons like for BPC-157, only one small decade-old meeting abstract for UC, no studies in the proposed routes, characterization and injectable immunogenicity gaps, things like that. For TB-500, no human clinical studies. An in vitro study, non-human study, found the intact peptide did not promote wound closure, right? And this is being promoted for wound healing. And KPV proposed not to be added because no human clinical studies for the proposed use exist. Inconsistent freebase versus acetate characterization and unassessed injectable immunogenicity. So going down the line, MOTS-C proposed not to be added to the 503A bulk list. No human clinical studies, no evidence any outsourcing facility has compounded it, and it's on the WADA prohibited list. CMAX, 2 small uncontrolled studies, meaning there's no control group, show no meaningful pain relief, possible bleeding risk, and abuse-associated dopamine signal. Amideltide, human trials since 1981 were small, poorly controlled, inconsistent. Epitalon, telomerase activation raises unassessed carcinogenic risk, available studies too short, etc. So these are substantive objections. This isn't just based on preference or any other factor. So FDA has already submitted these assessments. They're being evaluated. They're available to the PCAC. They're on the FDA.gov PCAC webpage. And the therapeutic claims are being forwarded by sponsors, meaning companies that seek to have these placed on the 503A bulk list. And so, and I believe there's generally 2 or 3 sponsors total that have submitted these compounds to FDA for consideration, and that's why they're before the PCAC.
And I hate to throw cold water on people's expectation of what the FDA will do here. You know, it certainly suggests that there's been a bend by the FDA in the past against these products, and the FDA has come out recently and reasserted its viewpoints here. That being said, I think one of the things, and we'll talk about this towards the end of the presentation on what we think is going to happen next. I do think the notion of creating the PCAC with a group of loyalists, with a group of people that are pro peptides, is being used to set up alternative pathways to potentially get these included. But it is really interesting to see where the FDA has come out in the past and where they're coming out now with respect to the actual clinical claims of these products. So, Edgar, why don't you talk a little bit about what has happened up until this point and what might actually be the gadfly that leads the FDA to do something to create a pathway for peptides now?
Sure. You know, we've gone into a very sort of granular level discussing the PCAC, the process, the peptides that are going to be evaluated in the next couple of days, but pulling out the 30,000-foot view is, why are peptides so popular today? What's the general context for both, patients, consumers, RUO peptide companies, compounding pharmacies, and ultimately the push for having some of these peptides placed on category 1 or on the bulk list. Why is that such an issue now? These peptides have been around for a long time. Why now? Well, between 2020 and 2023, right, during COVID, influencers on the internet, like Dr. Peter Attia, Professor Andrew Huberman, and Joe Rogan, that everybody knows, spotlighted BPC-157, TB-500, CJC 1295, and ipamorelin for healing, recovery, and demand surged, though none of these were FDA approved. And I always state that Dr. Peter Attia and Andrew Huberman are sophisticated and trained enough that they can speak about these things very eloquently, but also they understand the limitations of the safety profile of these. And if they choose to experiment and biohack these things, I think they have quite a bit of training to understand the limits and potential downsides to injecting an unapproved drug that may have come through a research chemical company that imported Chinese API that facility has never been inspected by FDA. I think they know they can better assess the risk. But when you put it out in the internet and expand the use of the potential benefits of these without understanding the context that, like we just saw in the previous list, there's only animal studies, in vitro studies, there's not enough human safety studies, there's actual concerns with carcinogenicity, things of that sort. The average consumer or patient doesn't have the sophistication or knowledge to make that discernment. Nevertheless, these were talked about in a very popular fashion, and the next layer of influencers below Attia and Huberman, et cetera, picked it all up, and everybody's talking about BPC-157 all of a sudden. This is where the gray market appeared. Why? Because with no approved products, the supply moves through these chemical vendors that are selling vials labeled research use only and not for human use, in order to sidestep the FDA regulation. Why? Because if you're selling it for human use, you need to have gone through some approval pathway, the PCAC pathway, or the bulk list pathway, or FDA's phase 1, 2, and 3. What happened was also that FDA had, when that happened, FDA, let me back up. Compounding pharmacies started producing these because there was demand. The demand between 20 and 23 spiked, and consumers and patients wanted these compounds. They'd heard about them. They had these potential therapeutic value that patients and consumers were looking for. And in response, FDA in September of 2023 placed 19 of these peptides into category 2, as Jesse explained, the do not compound list. So it's the do not compound 503A list, because many of these, as I showed you in the previous slide, may present significant safety risks, and barred these compounding pharmacies from preparing BPC-157, TB-500, CJC 1295, ipamorelin, melanotan 2, MOTS-C, CMAX, and others. So 19 of these peptides were removed. And remember, compounding pharmacies have pharmacists that have licenses that are regulated, and they cannot endanger their licenses by compounding and dispensing something that FDA has placed on the category 2 list. So that shut down the source, the compounding source for these peptides. Now, in September, some of these 5 of these peptides were removed from category 2, but not for scientific or clinical reasons. It's just that their nominations, meaning the company that had nominated them, said, I'm unnominating them. Don't evaluate this, FDA, right? So some of these were in that limbo of, it's not an approved peptide, it's not on category 1, but it's also not on category 2. It's not prohibited. All right, so those go into that gray limbo. But Importantly, though, 19 peptides ended up at the end of 2023 on the Category 2 list. And that's when the RUO peptide sector boomed, because then they were the only source of these peptides. Compounding pharmacies weren't going to risk the pharmacist's license by compounding something that was on Category 2. So online vendors started selling research-grade peptides straight to consumers through websites labeled research use only, and these were bought by biohackers, by people interested in what the influencers had said are the potential benefits. And therefore, the 2023 Category 2 action that FDA took once they saw that these were being dispensed by 5038 compounding pharmacies, that action affected the compounding pharmacies but did not touch the RUO peptide channel. And therefore, as demand grew, the research use only peptide sector grew alongside. There was explosive demand, and commensurate with this, the almost 2 years ago now, year and a half to 2 years ago, the compounding pharmacies used to be able to compound essentially a copy of GLP-1s, of semaglutide and tirzepatide. But that got shut down because the shortage was over. And so these peptide, RUO peptide vendors, online vendors, also obtained API from China for those GLP-1s. And those became the big sellers for the RUO peptide sector. Yes, they sold all these other peptides also, but including semaglutide and tirzepatide. And that's when we started seeing action by Lilly and Novo Nordisk going directly at these companies. Almost all of the API supply comes from China. So the imports from China doubled to about 328 million in the first 3 quarters of 2025, feeding the fast-growing network of online research-use-only sellers. Through 2024, enforcement stayed relatively light from FDA. FDA is a big organization that has many priorities and limited workforce, and so FDA sent occasional warning letters, such as the Summit Research Peptides in December of 24, and acted against some of the vendors of the RUO peptides, but it was a drop in the bucket from an enforcement point of view. In 2025, we've seen an escalation, not only by FDA, but also boards of pharmacy who have jurisdiction over research use only sellers if they believe that that seller has the intent of selling it for human use. And therefore, it's no longer a RUO peptide, no matter what the label says. It is an unapproved drug that's being sold with the intention of human use. And so in September of 25, over 50 warning letters were sent to peptide sellers. And in June 2025, a raid closed Amino Asylum. And then the biggest RUO peptide seller, Peptide Sciences, biggest by a factor of several, shut down voluntarily. And it's presumed that there were serious conversations with FDA, and before an enforcement action would take place, they decided to close their doors and get out of the business.
And so just kind of building off of that, the way that peptides, research use only peptide sellers had been selling peptides had been through providing disclaimers, attestations, warnings, essentially saying you as a patient agree that, and they don't even use the word patient, you agree that this is research use only, you agree that you're not purchasing it for human consumption, you agree that you're not intending to consume it, you agree that you're buying this purely for research use only. And it tried to play up to the notion that, yes, for many of these products, it'd be totally appropriate for you to be able to buy this chemical for research use only purposes. The problem is the FDA's rules are intent based, and so that intent isn't isn't just masked by the fact that there is a simple attestation saying, oh, this is only for research use only. That intent is going to look at things like, did it suggest that it's going to be used for a particular therapy or for a particular bodily purpose? Is it being sold in conjunction with things like bariostatic water or things like syringes? And so that's where we started to see these warning letters and these discipline. Right here, you can see the language directly from one of the warning letters. Despite statements on your product labeling, marketing your products for laboratory research purposes only and not for human consumption, medical use, or veterinary use, evidence obtained from your website establishes that your products are intended to be drugs for human use. Your products are drugs as defined by Section 201 G1 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act because they are intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease and or intended effect of the structure of the function or function of the human body. So right there, that's the standard. That's the standard for what is a drug, and it's a standard for whether or not something is being sold as a drug. And so when you and as I mentioned, that intent can be inferred. It's not simply negated by some kind of disclaimer or some kind of short attestation. It really is a totality of the circumstance. In addition to those warning letters, we saw other federal enforcement. For example, the Customs and Border Patrol has been regularly seizing or holding imports of peptide products, especially the API that's used for research use only peptide products. We've also seen some criminal investigations and prosecutions. The FDA and DOJ have initiated a number of criminal prosecutions against individuals and firms accused of importing or distributing research use only peptides. It usually starts with an undercover agent buying peptides from the distributors' websites and looks at the communications between the distributors and those buyers to help, again, focus on the intent of the seller, that they were intended to be used for human consumption. Historically, this investigation and enforcement had been limited to the underground bodybuilding community, those folks buying peptides, those folks buying human growth hormones for purposes of use in bodybuilding. But now that it's expanded so wildly, it's expanding the focus beyond just that kind of underground bodybuilding community and into a broader market. The FDA isn't the only one that is enacting discipline. We've also seen a number of state boards of pharmacy enact disciplinary actions. The Ohio board, for example, issued multiple summary suspensions against compounding pharmacies and others that hold terminal drug distribution licenses, which is a unique licensing structure in Ohio, for producing or possessing or distributing unapproved peptides, including retatrutide and others. In addition, we've seen boards of nursing or boards of medicine take action or put out bulletins. In Utah, a physician was prosecuted and indicted for allegedly obtaining, recommending, delivering, and selling non-FDA approved peptides to his patients. And we've also seen, even if it's not necessarily enforcement or discipline, we've seen a number of boards kind of come out and provide information. Essentially say, hey, beware of these products, beware of the licensure implications, beware of the legal implications of prescribing these products, of dispensing these products, of storing these products. Alabama Board of Medical Examiners is a good one that had warned physicians against prescribing these products and about the risks to their own professional licenses if they were to prescribe them. So why does that matter? Because if there does become a lawful pathway for these products, a lot of this will change. There won't be this investigational drug, this non-approved product, this illegal research use only product. It will be traditional compounding pharmacy. So that's why so much is riding on this beyond just compounding pharmacies. Other stakeholders like medical practices, med spas, physicians, nurse practitioners are all potentially going to be affected by this. So what's going to happen, right? We have 2 days ahead of us. We have the PCAC that's going to make their recommendation, but there's a lot that's at stake. So Edgar, walk us through what the different scenarios that we could see in the next couple days, weeks, months, maybe even years.
Sure. So as you all know, PCAC is going to meet tomorrow and Friday, and at the end of those meetings, as I mentioned earlier, they will take they will make a recommendation to FDA, and that recommendation will be taken into account. Remember, FDA's CDER scientists have already pronounced themselves as to these not being sufficiently safe to be on the 503A bulk list. So if tomorrow, we have three scenarios here. If tomorrow the PCAC recommends inclusion in the bulk list and FDA agrees, then even the best case scenario, this is going to be a slow process. Since January 7th, 2025, FDA grants no interim category 1 access anymore. That program's over. So compounding is lawful only after a substance reaches the final 503A bulk list via notice and comment rulemaking. And we as administrative lawyers also understand what that means. What that means is that, yes, the vote will take place tomorrow and the next day. PCAC will make its recommendation. Then, if FDA agrees, then sometime thereafter, could be 1 month, 3 months, they will publish a proposed rule, a notice of proposed rulemaking. And then that will be followed, and that will detail why, and they will do that for each one of the peptides, and will detail why they're recommending that this end up on the 503A bulk list, and therefore become compoundable subject matter. Then the public will be able to comment as to why this should happen and why this should not happen. That takes place over 2 to 3 months. Then those comments have to be evaluated by FDA. And so sometime in 2027 or 2028, FDA would issue a final rule stating we've evaluated all this data, scientific data, comments from the interested public, and then would issue a new rule, basically in the CFR, stating this is now on the 503A bulk list and therefore is compoundable. And starting on that date, sometime in 2027 or 2028, then compounding pharmacies, 503As, will be able to compound that product. So there's nothing mind-blowing is going to happen tomorrow or the next day. It will be the beginning of this regulatory process if this is what the PCAC recommends and if FDA agrees. So let's go into scenario number 2. PCAC recommends inclusion of the peptides on the bulk list, but FDA disagrees, which is likely to happen. PCAC recommendations are advisory and non-binding. FDA can decline to propose the peptides for inclusion on the bulk list, and those peptides will remain ineligible, and current enforcement will continue against compounding pharmacies if they do engage in compounding these unapproved APIs. This means that the research use only peptide sector would remain the main source of access to peptides, which is absolutely not what FDA wants, right? There's, I think, I interpret Secretary Kennedy's showing up on the Joe Rogan show about 5 months ago and announcing that these were illegally placed on the category 2 and we're going to get them off. And he's a big supporter of peptides and stem cells and things of that sort. I think there's a real public health argument to be made, meaning, do we want the only source of these peptides to be online vendors who obtain their API from China, likely from a facility that is not FDA registered and does not have to operate at GMP levels, and then those are being sold without a doctor's prescription, and individuals are purchasing those peptides and injecting themselves every day of the week? Is that the only channel we want to be the source of peptides? Or, and here's the public health argument, or do we want to open up a channel that is the 503A, whereby a physician would have to write a prescription and that would be sent to a compounding pharmacy. Compounding pharmacy operates at certain strict quality levels, and then only then a patient receives these peptides. That seems like a more reasonable approach, something that FDA would support. But as I showed you, the science doesn't support these being placed on the bulk list. So likely there's going to be, if it's this scenario where PCAC recommends inclusion but FDA disagrees, then there's going to be intense stakeholder pressure, public health pressure, petitions, litigation, political attention. And this sets up the scenario that we think is possible, which is scenario 3. Secretary Kennedy invokes his 503A-C public health authority. Under Section 503A-C, Secretary Kennedy may skip the advisory committee first sequence, but only if it is necessary to protect the public health. Now, this provision has been used to place products on Category 2. It's never been used previously to place compounds in Category 1, meaning that the public health, protecting public health meant removing something from the stream of commerce, not placing it into compounding pharmacies and making it lawful for more people to access them. So it would be novel, but it's certainly within Secretary Kennedy's authority to place the peptides in something like Category 1, the bulk list, and permit interim access on that authority, potentially as a consequence of FDA saying, no, these don't merit being on the bulk list. Obviously, this would lead to litigation. It's not a settled legal question, and arguably this provision is only intended to remove compounds and peptides in this case from access to the public. But the reality is the public already has access to these compounds, and therefore the counter would be there's a public health emergency and we're going to prevent public health, and Secretary Kennedy will sign this, and in very short in very short order they would be available through compounding pharmacies. Those are the 3 scenarios.
And my thoughts on this and kind of mapping out the little bit of the chess game that's happened here is I suspect that the PCAC committee was convened as a means to create some either political cover or maybe even legal cover for Secretary Kennedy to potentially do this, to potentially have some basis to say, well, look, the PCAC committee recommended it, so I'm going by the team of experts here. Obviously, the drawbacks, as Edgar alluded to, is this is untested. It's not, a historically used framework. It would very, very likely be subject to attack and to litigation from opposing parties, possibly even defecting FDA personnel. But beyond that, it's because it's being done by the secretary outside of the proper rulemaking and legal channels. There's the possibility that if there's a change of administration, that it could just as easily be undone. It's the same thing we saw with a number of the executive orders by any administrations. They can be binding and powerful while the president is in office, but as soon as the president changes, they can be undone just as easily. So something to consider in terms of speed versus longevity. But we will be continuing to monitor what happens over the next 2 days. With the PCAC meetings. We encourage anyone that has questions or wants more insight or information to reach out to us. We've put our contact information here. And we will continue to stay abreast of these developments and hope that you guys found this interesting and insightful.